Councilmember Marine.
Here.
Thank you. Councilmember Mead. Councilmember Merrill.
Here.
Thank you. Mayor Nearing.
Here.
Thank you. Labor Representative Norton.
Here.
Thank you. Councilmember Roberts.
I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Schweddy.
Here.
Thank you. Mayor Smith will be joining in progress. And Councilmember Wright.
Good afternoon. Here.
Oh, thank you. Chair, we do have a quorum. I'll also take roll call for board alternates. Councilmember Gallagher.
Here.
Do we have Councilmember Johnson? Mayor Matsumoto Wright? Councilmember McNeil? Councilmember Nearing? And I do see Councilmember Mead that you've joined. Thank you.
Yep, I'm here.
Thank you. Chair, that does conclude roll.
All right, thank you. Next up is public comment. We have two types of comment, verbal comments and written comments. Signed up to speak is completing a sign up form. Please provide by 12 p.m. today. I guess that was a while ago. And we have one written comment from Mr. Joe Kunzler that was routed to the board in advance of the meeting. And we have Mr. Joe Kunzler wants to also speak. So let's bring Mr. Kunzler in and let him have the floor. And Mr. Kunzler will have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will set my timer to 2:30. I want to thank the board for having me today. I want to first address what the actual meeting is going to be about, which is the budget and the long range plan. And then we'll talk about the COVID-19 stuff. But I went through the presentation today. I really have one criticism of the presentation in advance, and that the presentation does not address the ongoing concerns of coverage versus frequency versus span of service. And let me walk you, board members and staff, through that in case you don't know. Coverage is how many places can you serve with the service hours you've got. Frequency is how frequently you serve those stops. You serve, Swift in about 12 minutes or less. And that's why I'm using the Swift background. And span services, how much time throughout the day, from like 6 a.m. till 10 p.m. or maybe 5 a.m. until 11 p.m. Those are what those three concepts are. And I really think that for this phase one of the long range plan, you need to be focusing on that. Phase two is going to require connections, and I'm somewhat concerned about making sure we have a bus connect from Everett Station to Wynwood Link in 2024. That is one of the reasons why I'm going to be so actively engaging in this process. The other one is to connect the future of flight on the northwest corner of Payne Field. And I'm not terribly worried about the budget. I want to say at the outset, in case any staff who are prepared to budget are on this call, you did an awesome job. The budget was very thorough, and I enjoyed reading it in second reading between the Seahawks disaster that was Monday Night Football and recovering from a booster shot. So thanks for your hard work, staff, all staff. I do want to spend the last minute I've got on COVID-19. You've all seen the letter to the editor, I hope, today. You've all, I emailed all of you. I hope you took to heart my 1,200 word public comment. It took me from 1 o'clock on a Saturday until 11 something at night to send, because I was so upset over the thought of using a weekly testing instead of just getting vaccinated. I'm concerned for all the staff, but especially the parents who work at community transit. I'm a lucky son. I got 2 healthy parents, and I don't think it's fair or right to have this weekly testing thing, because somebody could be tested clear on Friday, thank goodness, by Monday they're infected. And what if, heaven forbid, we have an inter-outbreak at community transit? I'm thinking in particular of one special employee down there, and I am really trying, as well as Rick, as well as Sabina, and the father would be somebody I know dealing with this virus. After the setback I had just from the booster yesterday, horrifies me. I really hope that when you are negotiating with labor, that you prioritize defeating the virus. I do finally want to conclude my public comment with the bit of good news, happy news that you all deserve. Two bits of happy news. First happy news is that BART, which has a vaccine mandate, they got their percentages up to 80% as of today. The second bit of good news is that I'm hearing there's a marketing campaign coming in the winter and spring to get people to choose transit first. So hang in there, be strong. I got your backs. Let's go, Rick. Let's get everybody vaccinated, okay? Thanks for having me
Mr.
today.
Kungler. Thank you. Is there anybody in the audience that would like to speak? If so, please raise your digital hand. Out of the 10 attendees in there, I don't see anybody raising their hand. And I'll close the public comment portion of our workshop. Next up is the Chief Executive Officer's report, Mr. Engelfritz.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. You'll be pleased to know this will be my shortest CEO report ever. I don't have a CEO report beyond highlighting our two topics for today. We have a board meeting next week, so I'll hold business items for my report next week. We're here today to review the proposed 2022 budget, which we're excited to present to the board and discuss with you, and also to kick off our update of our long-range plan. Our current long-range plan has a horizon of 2030, which is just around the corner. And we are undertaking a process to extend our planning horizon to 2050 to align with the Puget Sound Regional Council. So I'll spend some time with the budget team introducing and going over the budget, and then Roland will step up with his team, and we'll also have our long-range planning consultant join us to lead us through the kickoff of that process in the second part of the workshop. So we're looking forward to that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so now precedence has been set. That'll be great.
That was less than 3 minutes, right?
Yeah, I think this joke is getting old, don't you? Okay, so the next thing up is our presentations. First presentation will be 2022 proposed budget, and Mr. Engelfritz, you're back on again.
All right, great. Well, I will kick it off with a little bit of an overview, and then Mary and Jerry are here to go through the details. Our Crackerjack budget team, our award-winning budget team, I might add. So this, let's just advance to the next slide, Rachel. This is a slide you've all seen before. It shows our planning cycle and how our various planning processes layer with each other. And this is an interesting day because we're concluding this planning cycle by reviewing our annual proposed budget for 2022 and also starting anew our long-range planning cycle later in the afternoon. So it's fun to see two parts of this planning paradigm happening in the same day. Let's go ahead and first to the next slide, reflect on a couple of key accomplishments over last year that sort of set the context for our proposed 2022 budget. It's been a second year of responding to the pandemic and prioritizing safety first. And we've managed through the challenges of that process successfully. I think we all felt the frustration of kind of a false start on recovery midsummer when it looked like we were turning the corner before the Delta wave hit us. But we've managed to persevere through that, keeping our safety prioritized, keeping our service constant, not missing a day of service, and keeping our customers and our employees safe. We began to focus on ridership recovery with a safety campaign and an outreach campaign to our customers to talk to them about the things we're doing with our service to make sure it's safe for them to use. And gradually, bit by bit here in the second half of the year, we've seen a return of ridership, modest, but significant in our commuter services. So we hope to continue that trend into the new year. Big focus this year on integration and expansion. Obviously, everybody was there to experience the opening of the Northgate segment and our first ever connection to light rail. And that came off really well and sets the table for us to spend the next 2 years getting ready for the opening of the Linwood Link segment. We continued to advance the expansion of the SWIFT network. really successful financial partnership with the federal government bore fruit this year and has put us in a position to begin construction of the Orange Line next year. And we also advanced planning for the extension of the Blue Line down to the Shoreline Station and also the Green Line eventually into UW Bothell. We've teed up a new modes innovative pilot program, which will be launching next year. Lengthy outreach and coordination process within the city of Linwood with city staff and the citizens of that city to shape a pilot program to begin experimenting with innovative service, and in this case, microtransit. So that's teed up and ready to go based on the work we did this year. And of course, we advanced our base expansion with not only the near completion of the new administration building over at Cash Park, but also starting the base expansion here at Merrill Creek. We laid the groundwork for the future by kicking off a couple of key processes. One I've already mentioned, the long range plan, but also starting our zero emission fleet study, which was the subject of a previous workshop, and also starting our outreach on our planning to restructure our network for 2024. And last but not least, we initiated a diversity, equity, and inclusion program. We took our executive leadership team through an intensive training and also hired a diversity program officer to begin supporting all of our departments as we think about how we can do our jobs better to engage with our community, to reach people we haven't been reaching, and to do the best possible job we can of bringing people into our processes and provide the benefit of our services to them. So that sort of sets the table for what we're proposing for next year. If we could move to the next slide, Rachel. As we put the 2022 budget together, we had a few key principles in mind. Obviously, we wanted to align with our mission, vision, and values and put forward a budget that helps people get from where they are to where they want to go, to have that experience be easy and convenient, but also be nimble to reflect the evolving needs of our customers and the communities we serve. There's a lot of change on the horizon, not just with the light rail line coming, but also with all the growth that we see around the county, with the changes in how people are making decisions about how they get around, how they use transit, how they use other transportation services, how they view car ownership. So we wanted to have in mind this thought that we could be nimble and adaptive as our service territory changes around us. We also wanted to provide a balanced budget that makes strategic use of the one-time funding we've been able to secure through our partnership with the federal government, and also to sustain service and operational continuity. This is a significant budget in that it includes an ambitious increase to our capital program based on those one-time resources we've received. And we want to make sure that as we plan how we use those resources and take advantage of this opportunity, that the decisions we're making are sustainable over time. So we look not only over our 6-year planning horizon, but really out over a 25-year horizon to make sure that the choices we make today are sustainable long-term. And then we wanted to make sure we had a resilient budget to weather uncertainties. It's metaphorically rainy out there, and we never quite know what's going to hit us where the weather is concerned. We also don't know when and how this pandemic is going to play out. So we wanted to make sure that we have a resilient budget with robust reserves and the ability to adapt to the unexpected as we go. So with that in mind, we focused on a few strategic priorities for the 2022 budget. Next slide, please. And those are shown here. Obviously, it starts with operational continuity and safety in responding to COVID and playing through this situation we're in, making sure that our safety measures are fully deployed, that we're staying disciplined about how we're operating, providing a safe workplace and a safe space for our customers. But then looking ahead and planning for the future. We're going to get a taste of that later today, and you're going to hear us talk at length in future months about the 2024 network and about how we adapt and take advantage of this opportunity we have to leverage the regional investments. Of course, looking ahead begins with keeping our focus on expanding our SWIFT network. So 2022 will bring with it that groundbreaking on the Orange Line to deliver that project and those services in time for the Linwood Link opening. We'll also be kicking off the Gold Line planning to take the SWIFT quality of service up into the northern part of the county and serve the Cascade Industrial Center in both Marysville and Arlington. We will continue to advance work on extending the Blue Line to Shoreline, and we'll also continue to engage with the City of Bothell, Sound Transit, and WashDOT on bringing the Green Line down to connect with their Stride BRT service. Innovation is going to be a key theme going forward. You'll see it not only in our experimentation with microtransit. We'll be launching the Linwood pilot this coming calendar year, and we'll be looking to learn from that, how we can scale services to meet markets at a lower price point, at a lower level of market demand, and bring more people into our overall system. We're really excited about the opportunity to learn how this can work and how we might be able to translate what we learned in Linwood to other parts of the county. You'll also see an innovation theme in how we're approaching our zero emission vehicle study. There is news breaking and cryptic from the federal government about a potential infrastructure package and a major investment in zero emission technology as part of the national and state level responses to climate change. And we want a position to take advantage of that prudently and appropriately given our service profile. And then last on this list is our continued commitment to completing our base expansion program to support service growth long term. You've heard it before, but to state it again, our facility master plan is designed to accommodate a 30% growth in transit demand in the county over the next 20 years. And our operations base expansion, the new administration building, the new transportation headquarters, and the new training and storage facility all support that growth. So those will be our key strategic priorities in the new year. Next slide, please. At a high clip, the proposed budget looks a little like this. You'll see on the left side in blue is our operations budget for sustaining operations in all of our services. And on the right in green is our capital budget. You'll note that this is a significant increase in our capital budget from prior years. So it's reflecting the start of the Orange Line construction. It's reflecting the advancement of the facility master plan. It's reflecting funding of some key strategic reserves to support fleet procurement in the future and other initiatives like IT capital replacement and service innovation, transit speed and reliability, and bus stop improvements throughout the county. So this is a significant capital program, and we're very excited about the possibilities and the quality of service it can mean for our customers. And as I said at the top, we want to make sure that this is reviewed in the context of a sustainable long-term financial plan. So Mary's going to go through what's in each of these slices in detail in a minute. And as I get ready to pass it off to her, I want to show you that 25-year look ahead that we're modeling, which is the next slide. So this is a forecast of our revenues and expenditures out to 2044. And this is using a long-term forecasting model that is managed in our planning group. On the left side of this slide, you see the 6-year slice encompassed by our transit development plan. And that includes all of the investments that I've just described here, the BRT expansion, the facility master plan expansion, and some of those capital reserves for fleet, IT, and other infrastructure. And the green line shows our revenues long-term, dark blue capital, light blue operating. And then the gold line shows our reserves that are set aside. So as you will recall, we pre-fund all of our capital projects, and the yellow line shows those funds being set aside to support delivery of those investments. So those lines can always adjust up if we add more capital projects in the future. But I wanted to show, and I'm used to looking at financial plans over a 25-year horizon. Coming from Sound Transit, that was our normal MO, given the length of those investments. So I wanted to see what our future looked like, forecasted out over this period, and reassure you that we're on a sustainable long-term path. So with that in mind, I'll stop there and pass the baton over to Mary, and she'll walk through the details.
Next slide, Angie. Thank you. So these are the elements that we'll be going over in the next part of the presentation. I'm going to try to go relatively quickly to get through all of your questions by the end. I wanted to point out to you that you were provided with links to the budget document, and with any luck, the CEO message and the executive summary should provide most of the information that you would be looking for. As we go through the slides, we have identified the page numbers that you can find more detail on. So if you have questions about something like capital or revenue, you can go back to those particular pages in the budget document. Also contained in the budget document is a lot more detail about our departments, what their 2021 accomplishments were, their 2022 priorities, and just a lot of great detail. So at that, I'm going to take you through the nuts and bolts of our 2022 budget. So next slide, please. This is a chart that shows our sources and uses of CT funds. At the top, you see the revenues that come in to community transit, the operating revenues that come into the general fund, and then our capital grant revenues. So first of all, we fund our operating expenses. First and foremost, we pay for what it takes to provide service, and then our other obligations. And then after that, we're able to we fully fund our capital program. And then we fund our reserves. And just for some context, in 2022, our reserve balances are estimated to be about $257 million. Next slide, please. In 2022, we expect our operating revenues to be $263 million. That is about 14% higher than our current amended budget. Sales tax will be 70% approximately of the general fund revenues. That's a little higher percentage than we anticipated last year at this time. Another significant source is the reimbursement that we receive from Sound Transit. This is the funding that Sound Transit gives us in order to deliver their services up here in the north. Another very large category is our grant revenue. Most of that is the federal stimulus that we are receiving this year and next year. Next slide, please. So this shows our past collections of revenue, of sales tax revenue specifically for the last couple years. As you can see, our sales tax collections did indeed grow in 2020. Despite the pandemic and the projected downturn, we still expect or anticipated some growth. We are again projecting growth throughout this year, 2021. We expect that we will have collected about 14% more this year than we did last year. And then the 2022 budget anticipates about a 5.5% growth. This is very much in line with our current experience. 2023 through 2026, we're back to more of a normal growth rate of about 4% per year. That's in line with our historic experience in terms of sales tax growth. And I do want to point out that as the TDP was being adopted, we were actually back at the drawing board reprojecting these sales tax numbers. Our collections have not ceased to amaze and astound us. So we have actually gone forward and done additional reprojections for the out years. Next slide, please. Two other very important revenues to community transit are fare revenues and our federal grant revenues. We expect next year to collect fare revenues of about $13 million. That will be about 52% higher than what we expect in the current year. We're currently forecasting about $8.5 million. Federal grant revenues will come in at about $36.6 million next year. A little bit of that will be CRISA funds that we're still billing next year. We also anticipate about $32 million in ARPA billings. And for anyone who was expecting ARPA to be slightly higher than that, well, good news, it is. We do expect more ARPA billing into 2023. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot of our historic service hours and ridership, as well as the projections that we're making for the future. Service hours is a very important element of the budget process. Many of our costs are directly based on our service hour projections. So in our operating budget, we have to consider coach operators and coach operators' salaries and benefits. We also have to budget for things like fuel and parts. And those are all directly driven by the number of service hours that we anticipate delivering. This graph shows back to 2009 when we had our previous highest level of service delivered. After the economic downturn, we started a slow growth up to our peak at 2019. And then, of course, 2020 are those pandemic numbers. We're now projecting some pretty good growth for 2022. And then by 2023, 2024, we should be at least pretty close to the prior high levels of service and ridership. With any luck, 2024 will exceed the high point in 2019. Thanks to planning for these projections. Next slide, please. In the general fund, we expect our operating expenses to grow by about 3.1%. As we're creating the budget in the early time frame of budget development, we create targets to make sure that we're constraining our growth according to TDP principles. We're looking at keeping our general fund growth to about 3.3%. So we take great I guess we put in a lot of effort to come up with a target to ensure that our costs are going to be sustainable over the long run. It's very critical for us to do this early planning. In the other category that we have in the general fund, these are the transfers out of the general fund into our capital projects, our reserves, and other obligations. We are projecting or looking at a 220% growth. And these transfers fund those new capital projects, reserves, and a very tiny amount goes to other obligations. Next slide. So how do those operating expenses actually break down into specific categories? Well, wages and benefits are just shy of $97 million. That is actually not a lot of growth from the prior budget. However, we're doing something a bit new for 2022. Because of our significant capital effort and capital budget, we're actually attributing about 32 FTEs to our capital project funds. This is really to recognize the significant agency effort that we have toward capital development. So we are actually growing our FTEs and wages a little bit. We're adding about 16 and a half FTEs. Another major category is our purchase transportation. And while overall the net growth is rather limited, there are a couple of puts and takes in this category. Our DART budget is actually returning to normal levels of service for 2022. We're moving DART fuel to the fuel category. Community Transit will be paying for that in-house instead of reimbursing the contractor. So we'll be utilizing our state contract to generate some fuel savings there. But overall, we have a higher level of service that will be provided in terms of DART ridership. Then our contract commuter costs are actually decreasing a bit. We do not have to cover premium pay next year as we did this year. And those service recovery operator buses that we purchased to provide extra bus service mostly for our commuter riders, those will not be done in 2022. So we won't have those costs that we have to cover. So overall, just a small net increase. Our services budgets are increasing a bit. Some of this is restoration of things that we stopped doing during the pandemic, the restoration of travel and training, also some contracts in the advertising and professional services area. So for 2022, we'll be boosting some safety initiatives like the Transit Police Unit, and we have other things in that services category like the long range plan. Our fuel budget will go up a bit for 2022. Part of that is the increases in fuel costs. I think everybody sees those at the pump. We are increasing our expected fuel rate from $2.07 a gallon in the amended budget to $2.40 in the proposed 2022 budget. And this also includes some DART fuel. And then our parts and supplies increase as we put more service out. Next slide, please. Our FTEs will be increasing slightly for 2022, up to 824 FTEs. We're maintaining an 80-20 split between the operations and maintenance staff and the administration staff. That's something that we have historically tried to do for the last 10 plus years. We've been successful at growing each category of staff proportionately. And this is categorization based on what our FDA regulations, how they categorize actual job functions. Next slide. And here is a summary of the proposed capital budget. As Rick mentioned earlier, this is a very large capital budget. It's up 36% from the current year's amended budget. It is consisting of about 130 million of new capital and then 56 million of carryover capital. And then if we add in about 5 million of personnel costs that are shifting to the capital budgets to reflect where their actual work is being spent, that's about 191 million. Next slide, please. These are the categories of capital projects. The SWIFT program is the largest item or set of items in our capital budget, and it is almost all new capital. It's about $75 million for the orange line and almost $11 million for the blue line expansion. And efforts are being started also on the gold line. And then the facilities master plan is the continuation of the base expansion projects. We're still replacing vehicles next year. The $20 million is for both buses and DART and van pool vehicles. Those are replacement vehicles. We actually have our BRT buses categorized in the SWIFT program. Innovation consists of the wireless project and NG Orca, as well as a new project for zero vehicle emissions. And then this year we're categorizing a fair number of our projects as state of good repair projects. Next slide. So one of our priorities really in the 2022 budget is the investment in our strategic priorities. And having fairly robust reserves is what really supports this strategic investment. We're able to do all of these projects, and we're able to ensure that we can support our business into the future because we've been able to build up reserves. In the operating fund, we've designated $83 million of our cash balance as an operating reserve and as a fuel reserve. And then the remainder is for sustainability and expansion. We have a replacement reserve for revenue vehicles consistent with the TDP. In our infrastructure preservation reserve, we have several new things happening here. We've increased our facilities infrastructure reserve based on our consultant recommendations. We had a consultant review our reserve strategy. And so that's been increased to 17 million from 10 million. And then our IT infrastructure reserve is brand new. So we have a significant investment in our IT capital, in systems and in IT infrastructure. And we want to make sure that we stay in great shape here. And then in our facilities and technology fund, we have some brand new reserves. We have $50 million that we're setting aside next year for the zero vehicle emissions project. Then we're making the first contribution toward a reserve for new service, sustainability, and innovation. And then the remainder of the balance in this fund is related to the facilities master plan projects. And then the rest are other required obligations. So we expect to have cash in the bank of 288 million at the end of next year. Next slide, please. So if we circle back to that first chart that I showed, the sources and uses chart, you might recall seeing the general fund revenue and the current obligations. This shows a snapshot of what's happening with the general fund more in numeric terms. We're starting out the year with about $191 million in general fund cash. And then during the year, we add revenues and we use some of those for current obligations for an operating margin of about 91 million. And that's important to focus on because we have a margin available as we expand service in the future. So we will be able to cover new service costs in the TDP as we planned for in the 6-year plan. But between our current beginning cash and our operating margin, we're going to be able to transfer everything we need for those reserves as well as our capital projects and obligations. That's the 169 million. So we end up with 113 million of cash in the general fund. Of that, we've set aside 6 months operating reserves and 5.5 million in fuel reserves. So we end the year with $30 million capacity for sustainability and expansion. Next slide. So this is a list, definitely not an all-inclusive list, of all the many things that are contained in the budget. We have quite a bit of efforts on network integration, 2 full staff dedicated to this, as well as consulting funds to cover work on this. As we mentioned before, with the SWIFT network, we're starting 2 new SWIFT projects next year, the build out of the Orange Line and also the Green Line expansion. So an $89 million set of projects are covered under SWIFT. Innovation, lots of things going on in this category. We have the Linwood pilot and another pilot program that we're budgeting for, including a contingency in the general fund that will cover these efforts next year. There are 2.5 staff approximately dedicated in customer experience who work directly on new program development, on determining what will work for the public and how to deliver new service such as, microtransit and on-demand types of transportation. We also have NG Orca and the My Orca app coming on board next year. Lots of work being done on our website also for the public. And the zero emissions vehicle study, which will really be the start of a new program coming up next year. We talked about the base expansion earlier. It's $57 million in new and carryover capital funds. And this is an ongoing set of projects that will last until, I believe, early 2025. So lots of activity going on here. Safety and COVID, also many items contained in the 2022 budget. We're expanding the transit police unit, as well as a program to add some social work efforts on our transit system. We still have many safety measures that we're taking. Those efforts are continuing into 2022. One initiative that we've had ongoing has been to install the air purifying technology on buses. We want to keep our drivers and our riders safe. We've also focused in this budget how to address the evolving needs of customers and our community. The Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program is still a big focus with expanded public engagement and its own program now within the employee engagement budget. Our new website will have more modern tools for customers. We're increasing our ridership campaign and public engagement efforts next year as well. In the state of good repair category, of course, we've got IT preservation funds program next year, and we're fully replacing vehicles and that we need to on our vehicle schedule. And we have a brand new bus stop program that is starting. This is to enhance and revitalize bus stops throughout the PTBA and ensure that they're meeting our customers' needs. And then last but not least, we want to secure our future by balancing, the use of our one-time funding with current needs as well as sustainability and expanding and fully funding our reserves. We're really looking at how do we invest in our future? How do we keep us going through the good times and any potential economic downturn into both the 6-year and the 25-year horizon? Next slide, please. So you're probably wondering what's coming up next with the budget. Next week at the board meeting, there will be a public hearing on this budget. At that meeting, members of the public and others can come and provide their feedback. And at that time, you may have formulated some questions for us. So we'll give you another week or so, and then you can submit your questions to me or to Jerry, and we will answer those questions and provide you with answers and feedback at Finance Performance and Oversight, as well as an emailed document to the full board. At that committee meeting, we will also present the budget resolution and likely a current year, a year-end budget amendment. And then the target date for you to approve the budget is December 2nd, with the goal of having a board-approved budget by 12/31, so we can start out a brand new fiscal year. Next slide, please. So again, if you have any questions, this is how you can get them to Jerry and me. If you have questions now, please feel free to ask them.
Thank you, Mary. That was very good. I appreciate it. Anybody have any questions? I think most of us are budgeted out right about now.
Before I move on, can I say one last thing? I just really wanted to give a lot of credit to our departments, those in our departments who spent a lot of work on this budget, to our budget team, to our leadership team, to Rick and all the directors. This was a lot of work. And then we have a number of reviewers on our finance team and one honorary finance member from IT who helped us review the budget document for you. So I just wanted to say that I have a great team supporting this process, Jerry and Rick and everyone in finance. So thank you.
Well, from the many awards that your group has gotten and the way CT operates all the time since I've been on the board, which is about 10 plus years, I see this happening on and on and on and on. You guys are great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask one more time if there's any questions from the board to either Jerry or Mary or even Rick. Go ahead, Mayor Naring.
Yeah, great job, Rick, Mary, everybody involved. I know the whole team on the budget, having sat on the finance committee for a number of years, I know a lot of work goes into this, and we get, Jerry, you and your team get a lot of great awards for the financial management of the agency. So I thank you for that. It looks like another really good budget. It's always hard to find questions because you guys are so thorough. And this isn't really, I guess, the fuel market is always interesting. I know some of my early years on the board, we were pretty high, and we bought this fuel hedge, and we went really low, and now we're creeping back up, and it looks like you've got a very healthy fuel reserve. But I just didn't know if anybody had looked. I don't necessarily think a fuel hedge makes any sense, but do we evaluate that on a yearly basis to see if that, I don't know if it's fuel insurance or fuel hedge, I can't remember what they called it, if that makes any sense? And again, I'm not advocating for it. I just wondered if we've looked at that regularly.
We haven't looked at it in a few years. It was based on the Brent crude index, and we actually had to have astronomically high increases for it to pay off. And it really at one point seemed like we were paying, a couple $100,000. Maybe I'm overthinking or overestimating this, but $100,000 or $200,000 for something that was just not likely to pay off. And it was more like an insurance policy. You're correct.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. That's kind of what I figured. And it looks like you've built up a nice reserve, and we're already at a pretty high price. So hopefully it won't go too much higher anyways. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
I was just going to say, Mr. Chair, if I could too,
Sure.
I do have to unfortunately log off about 4. The questions that were sent that will be addressed, I found it really hard to prioritize that. I was wondering if there might be more context in the staff briefing. They all 3 are really worthy priorities. I mean, if you really want me to, I can, but it seems to me, I just don't like those kind of, well, I'm sure you're looking for something there, but it was just difficult for me to prioritize, to be honest with you, but I'll leave it at that for right now. And I can certainly, when I get back tomorrow, prioritize one or something of that nature if need be, but I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Sure. And this is a kickoff conversation. So this is a process that'll play out over the next year, and we'll have ample opportunity to talk about the direction of the agency and for you to express your views in that regard. So, the way the questions were set up, they come at the end of the presentation. So you get that context and then, get prodded to react to it. So it's just an exercise, and we can coordinate offline to make sure, you've got that opportunity to help steer the ship.
Great. Thank you.
So I'd like to add on to that, what Mary Nearing was talking about. I did the 3 questions and it was like, okay, was that it? Just 3 questions, only one time, because nothing else happened. It kept saying refresh, refresh, refresh. And if I refreshed, I got the same 3 questions over again. So I didn't know if there was more or less or whatever. So I didn't see a graph of how the responses were, which is what I was expecting, but and it might have been me. I was having a hard time with connectivity today. In another meeting, I dropped off, internet went away, but so I don't know if that's the cause of it. I just don't know.
Yeah, I think it'll be more intuitive after Aaron works through his presentation. We were trying to figure out a way to integrate the interactive exercise into Zoom. We couldn't find a way to do it, so that's why we sent the questions out in advance. So, we'll pause on that later in the presentation and be able to talk more fully. But the idea is to stimulate conversation and input. So.
Okay, on that note, if there's no other questions about the budget, we can move on with the long range plan. And Mr. Engelfritz, you're on again.
Great. Well, thank you for the feedback on the budget and for receiving that. We are in a moment financially where we've benefited a great deal from our federal partnership and from some of the strategic decisions this board has made in the past to put the agency on a sound financial footing. And that moment in time we're in now is really an opportunity to fully fund our capital program and to look to take care of our infrastructure. So we'll look forward to your questions on the budget and your consideration of it over the next month. So let's pivot now to big picture. We talked about a year in the life of a transit agency for the past 45, 50 minutes, and now we get to think in terms of decades. You think about how long you've served in your communities and the changes you've seen in your public service careers and your business careers, and what we're now tasked with doing is thinking ahead and trying to imagine what life in Snohomish County might be like in 2040 and 2050, and how Snohomish or how the community transit and the PTBA can step up and represent and serve in a changing environment. And so it's an exciting opportunity to sort of think in an unconstrained way, in a blue sky way, and position ourselves strategically for what may come. So I'll with that introduction, turn it over to Roland, and we have a special guest here, Aaron Goose, who's the leader of our consultant team, and he's been at this business of transit and land use planning for quite a while, and brings great perspective to our efforts. So we're happy to have him here as well. So Roland.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, we just to set a little context, I think many of the board members are familiar that, we've had a long range plan in place for more than a decade, and it's been a formative document for the agency, a real steering element in a lot of our efforts, things like building out our SWIFT network and other real key aspects of our growth over the past 10 plus years. But we are, as we've been, talking about in so many forums lately, our 2024 network planning for connecting with Linwood Link, the fact that we're now about to begin a very deep study of things like zero emission vehicles and new propulsion systems in the future. You're all aware of the innovative work we're about to undertake in Linwood, looking at different service models. There are so many things that are changing right now and that will have huge influence on our future. And so it's, we've been talking kind of a little bit flipped behind the scenes, but this is an opportunity for us to say, what are we going to be when we grow up? And, it's a chance to reset and to think about what are some of those opportunities, and to make sure that we really check in with the entire community, with all of you as well, so that we're making really good choices about how to maximize public investment in transportation to provide the best possible mobility that we can for the next 20 plus years. So it's an exciting time, and this is really a chance for some legacy work as we move forward, and the chance to really set a pattern for the future for the agency. So our goal today, as Rick said, this is a real early touch point with the board at the very beginning of the process. You had an early briefing on this over the summer in a previous workshop to just set some context. We're now into the process, and we've retained our consultant team and are just getting underway. So we wanted to check in early, give you a sense of the scope of what will be considered in the plan. And really the goal, success here today is really hearing from all of you. So, to the extent we can, we really want to engage you and get your feedback on direction for the effort, what some of your hopes and aspirations would be for the process. And I won't say a lot more than that, other than to say that we'll be keeping the board informed as we move forward. And as Rick said, there will be lots of opportunity for board awareness of the process, and for the opportunity for you to provide input, and then ultimately for you to approve the final plan. We've got our team here today. I do just want to briefly acknowledge Thomas Tamola is our manager of planning. His division will be leading this effort, and in particular, Sabina Araya, who's on the call, is our project manager. Sabina's done a great job of pulling things together to this point, and we'll be managing this project week by week as we move forward, and you'll be hearing more from her as the project moves ahead. And I'm going to hand this over to Aaron now. Aaron is with Fear and Peers, and they are the consultant team that we've procured to help us through this process. They've done this before. They've got a deep body of experience across the nation in doing this kind of forward thinking, and so we're excited to have Aaron walk us through this conversation today.
Great. And just making sure you can all hear me all right. The guests joining you all. So again, appreciate the intro, Rick and Roland, and really appreciate all your time as a board to kind of kickstart this process with the long range plan. And I think Roland really teed it up well of what is today's objective, and certainly recognize some of the early comments regarding kind of that priorities discussion. So as we get into that, I think there will be some good context about what are we trying to achieve with that particular question, and again, how is that setting us up for the rest of this process. So today I'll kind of highlight again just that broad high level touch on the project overview, what the phasing looks like for the long range plan development. We'll focus on touching on some of the details around the key trends that we see from our perspective as transportation planners, and what are those trends and the implications for those for planning for transit out to 2050. The third part will be this priorities exercise, and really it's about facilitating this initial discussion with this group prior to engaging with the public as a whole to get initial thoughts on key priorities for the long range plan. And then we'll touch on some next steps, and again, how we'll be engaging with you all and with the public throughout. So I just listed those two key objectives. One is just ensuring that you all have this initial understanding of what are those key trends that we're thinking about. Also acknowledging, are there other trends that we should be considering? And then the second bullet is really just some initial feedback on those priorities for how we define the role of community transit moving forward. So overall project overview, again, we're kicking off this phase one, which is really about visioning and in a market assessment. And this workshop is one of those elements. We've engaged with the executive leadership team. We'll also be engaging with your with a lot of your jurisdictions at the planning level, also internally with community transit departments and staff, getting this initial discussion going around what is the overall vision and role of community transit looking forward, and how can this tee up to really engage the public well, getting into the winter of 2022. That will lead us into some specific service development and scenarios, really testing these different priorities, testing quantitatively and qualitatively different outcomes for how to best address the needs going into 2050. All of that information, again, will be interpreted and reviewed. We'll gather more feedback in that phase 2, going into phase 3, where we synthesize a lot of the feedback and information that's been generated over this process into a draft and final plan for eventual adoption into early 2023. So again, throughout all of this, really robust public engagement with you all and other internal departments within the agency to help really advance this and ensure that we're gathering that feedback. And our role, again, as consultants, is just to help facilitate that discussion, provide information, provide analysis that really helps you all make those decisions for what is the direction that you want the agency to take. And we'll be there to provide that objective evaluation as needed. So getting into, again, how do we approach long-range planning and really just recognizing the scale and impact of the change that's already been underway just over the past year and a half, and then projecting that out to 2050. So there's always an uncertain future with transportation. That has been the case since the dawn of time, and certainly we recognize even a larger uncertainty because of a lot of the shifts that we've seen just over the past year and a half. So we think about this in terms of what are those broad economic, technology, land use, labor trends. There's the quote, fourth industrial revolution, which really looks at how does automation and additional technology advances really change our overall structure for how the economy operates, land use, housing, job forces, et cetera. And the timeline of 2050 for this long range plan really falls within how that shift could unfold over the next 30 years. More near term, but obviously projecting out long term is the idea around on-demand services and how we've seen with microtransit and TNCs or Uber and Lyft, how that has fluctuated over time, how it's built out as potential partnerships, but also in competition with transit. So that's another uncertainty that comes into this long-range planning process, which 10 years ago wasn't necessarily as big of a focus. Electrification, and I know in your budget discussion, really the focus on how zero emissions and electrification could play out. That's another uncertainty in terms of timing and scale. Autonomous vehicles, again, builds into that uncertainty, and recognizing the timeline of 2050 and still uncertainty of how autonomous vehicles will adapt over time, we need to build in some thinking and analysis around potential impacts of those vehicles. Quote, big data for market analysis. And again, this is something fairly recent where we can leverage emerging data sources such as cell phone, GPS sources to get a better handle on where are people traveling, when, why, and how. And that can help inform what is the potential market and how is that market shifting. And this is really important right now as we're trying to get a better handle on how has the pandemic potentially shifted those travel patterns, and is that something that will play out longer term, or is that a short-term change that we need to acknowledge? This next bullet, this renewed focus on equity. And certainly over the course of the pandemic and in light of a lot of the racial and social justice movements, recognizing the role of transit, providing that essential service to connect people to essential jobs and other services, and really that focus that we've seen across the country at many transit agencies on the focus of equity. And then finally, just acknowledging customer expectations and expectations for adaptability. The pace and rate of change for technology and transportation services continues to increase. And so how does that reflect on how community transit needs to respond to change and needs to kind of raise their role to fulfill what seems to be continuing increases in those customer expectations for how you'll adapt to an uncertain future. So these are some key trends, and I'll walk through in a little more detail on a few specifics as we think about how it relates to the long-range plan. So looking again at these broader trends that we've been talking about, this Trend Lab Plus tool is a tool we developed through research on travel demand forecasting. And really what we found is that while all of these factors that are listed here, they all have some effect on travel patterns, and they certainly can vary in the direction that they go over the next 30 years. But there really are three kind of key factors that we're really focused on just because of the scale for how they could impact transit planning and transportation demand. And suburban migration, again, recognizing kind of the change in household and job density and how that could drive travel patterns. Telecommuting or remote work certainly is a larger factor now than if we had conducted this process even a year and a half or 2 years ago. And then finally, the role, as I mentioned, of autonomous vehicles, and I'll touch on those in a little more detail in a later slide. So stepping back into land use and really understanding the context under which we're planning for 2050, there's a 50% increase in the population forecast for Snohomish County as identified in the PSRC Vision 2050. And if we look back 30 years ago, while that percent growth was larger, the scale of approximately 400,000 additional people over the next 30 years is similar to what was observed since 1991. And additionally, we really need to understand the potential implications of an aging population with that forecast increase in the proportions of adults that are over age 65. So looking at, again, the kind of both near-term and the potential long-term effect of on-demand services, that is a key part of this long-range plan. And our focus in this process is really helping you all to develop a framework for what are the goals and objectives for on-demand service and how can it best support the priorities for community transit, and really thinking about how to implement it successfully in conjunction with your traditional fixed route service and the broader transit system. In this example graphic, it's just from a study that we completed for the city of Cincinnati, and that approach really looked at establishing a framework for right-sizing the type of service to achieve different goals and priorities. And that will be a similar approach for how we look at this in the long-range plan. Zero emissions, again, as kind of one of those key trends that we'll want to focus on with the long-range plan. And this serves well with the feasibility study that will already be underway within your agency. So the long-range plan really looks at what are the implications and what are those priorities for zero emission operations, and really helps to guide that potential transition. I mentioned the major potential impact of autonomous vehicles and recognizing a lot of the uncertainty around the adoption and the technology advances for full autonomous vehicles. Currently today, there are some pilot programs leveraging kind of low speed autonomous shuttles in more controlled environments. And as we look out, again, the rate of technology change into the 2030s, 2040s is a timeline where wider scale deployment of these services could be more broadly implemented across the system. And long-range plans, certainly, we acknowledge, but don't directly plan for autonomous vehicle or autonomous transit operations. But it serves as additional context to recognize what are the potential impacts of different scenarios for how autonomous vehicles may be expanded over the next 30 years. And we've conducted some travel demand forecasting just to understand that scale and the potential to really drive travel demand either up or down, depending on the actual implementation of autonomous vehicles. And we've shown in general, if every vehicle was a personal autonomous vehicle, we've shown potential for a very large increase in vehicle miles traveled on average per person, and a potential decrease in transit. So just recognizing the potential challenges, potential opportunities with autonomous transit without necessarily specifically planning with those details in mind is how a long-range plan really goes about thinking through autonomous vehicles. I mentioned big data, and again, long-range plans really utilizing big data to better understand existing conditions. It provides a little closer look at how demand varies by time of day, by season, than we can get through traditional travel surveys or other means of data sources. And as I mentioned, kind of the impacts of the pandemic and looking at what are those near-term changes that we've observed with overall travel demand patterns, and understanding, is that a longer term trend or is that something that may be reversed longer term? So using big data allows us to have a better, at least paint a cleaner picture of what that looks like and maybe how that impacts our longer range planning. I mentioned the renewed focus on equity. And again, historically, there always has been a focus on equity with transit. And the pandemic and over the past year and a half has really kind of made us assess, changing the definition or really helping to better define what we mean by equity and how we measure that and how that translates into transit service planning and also capital planning. So this will be another key focus as part of the long range plan. And then finally, I mentioned the customer expectations for adaptability. And so more specifically with transportation, the emerging mobility services, they've really shifted expectations for what information is available, when it's available, how adaptable that service is, and really the rate of change. And recent surveys just of consumers, everyone year over year has higher expectations for customer service. So when we think about, what does that mean for community transit? It's thinking about outreach to customers, how we approach service planning, and the frequency and the type of that outreach, and also the rate of change that's feasible. So this is another consideration we'll include in the long-range planning process, how customer expectations have changed because of technology, and again, how does that impact the long-range planning focus and near-term actions for community transit. So before I move on to kind of our next topic, which is really focused around the mission and vision of community transit and getting into these priorities, I wanted to pause if there were any kind of clarifying questions on some of this information regarding how trends will be evaluated for this long-range plan, or if there's anything missing that you'd like to bring up.
Doesn't look like it, Aaron.
Okay, great. So again, the long-range plan is meant to be a guide of really how to fulfill the mission and vision and values over the next 30 years. And if we think through what is the mission of community transit, we help people get from where they are to where they want to be. And the vision is travel made easy for all. And you're grounded by the core values also of your agency. And so when we think through, for example, how do you define easy? How do you define all? How do you find help, for example? A long-range plan is really meant to help better define what those terms mean and how that translates into objectives and strategies over the next 30 years. And developing specific goals is really based on understanding the priorities for the community for how to best fulfill the mission and vision for community transit. And so that's what really leads us into this next discussion topic, where we pose the question to you all of thinking around this framework of what we call the 3 E's, and that's equity, efficiency, and the environment. And these priorities, again, really help inform how we approach both service planning for the long-range plan, thinking about how these terms translate into questions around service frequency, geographic coverage, service span, route structure, but also how you think about balancing capital and service investments. And the 3 E's, again, and I appreciate the earlier comment about it was really tough to rank these. And it isn't necessarily meant to solely be focused on how they rank. They're not meant to be mutually exclusive. And indeed, focusing on one priority will also help achieve the other two priorities. And we really just asked this question just to help facilitate a discussion on how you think about balancing different priorities. And again, how does that potentially translate into the role of community transit in 2050? So if you all were able to answer, and certainly if you weren't able to answer, what I'd like to do is bring up kind of the current results. And again, this is not meant to be a decision or a scientific poll. It's just to help facilitate the discussion around where you in particular stand when you think about these priorities, and also, is there something missing? And would you frame these in a different way? And this is an initial exercise just to think about how we would want to approach testing different priorities as we get into the service concepts and the scenarios, but also just stepping back to recognize what is the role of community transit and what are we really trying to fulfill over the next 30 years. So I'll bring up the current results so we can see where they're currently being ranked. And then I'll pause and I'll look to ask anyone if they have additional context or would like to kind of explain where they stood in terms of these priorities. So right now we show efficiency, so maximizing the ridership by prioritizing areas with the greatest demand. That is currently ranked first. Environment, reducing transportation greenhouse gases by focusing on longer distance trips and converting those trips to transit. And then third, equity, so expanding the access to opportunity and services for those who need it most. And the numbers are fairly close, and I wouldn't say that there's a great difference between these, but I'm interested to hear just more context around how you interpret these priorities and where you stand if you would rank one above the other, or if there really isn't any necessary weight behind any one of these three. So I'll pause there if anyone wants to kick off the discussion.
Mr. Chair, if I may. So Aaron led the executive leadership team through this exercise last week, and my first instinct was, well, I want more options. And we had a robust discussion about how we interpreted each of these and what we saw in them and what we might have seen missing. And just from my perspective, I think maximizing ridership is always key. But where I was hung up on that first option was prioritizing areas with greatest demand. We know today what our busiest travel corridors are, and we know how to serve them quite well. We don't know how that's going to change in the future. So, my thought was, well, we need an option that expresses our interest in going and finding those new patterns and figuring out how to go find people and bring them into the system so we can increase ridership by providing more coverage. So as an example of the type of debate we had at the ELT level about these, that was kind of how I put my thumb on the scale. I'll pause there.
Well, I guess I'll give my views on this then. I had a little bit of trouble. I mean, this came out exactly the way I ranked them. However, I had a little bit of trouble with first and third there, those two things. The equity, expanding access to opportunities and service those who need it the most is actually a very big key in the efficiency, the maximizing ridership prioritization to me. I think they're one and the same. I believe that going for some of those that are not being served or underserved is going to feed into maximizing ridership. Because the people that are underserved are the ones that actually need it, and the possibility is we're not getting there yet. And so that's going to help maximize our ridership. So I think one of those two, if you were to just take that, and those operate in parallel as far as I'm concerned. So that's my story, and I'm going to stick to it.
Chair, yeah, interesting, because this came exactly the way that I had ranked them as well. And some of again, thinking along the same way as you, the greatest demand, right? What is demand? The people who are demanding more service, right? They're demanding the service, and we ought to be, that's our ridership. As far as those who need it most, if they're needed the most, they're probably also demanding it, right? So I saw both of those being pretty close. And are we saying that we're actually going to maximize ridership in areas who need it the most, but you don't use it. That doesn't make any sense either, right? There has to be a demand for it. And yes, I want to use it and I need the service and I want to use the service. So that's where I guess a little more confusion there. And then of course the environment seemed naturally to come in second, because again, if 1 and 3 seem to be linked. So that's kind of my take on it.
Go ahead, Jan. You're muted.
Oh, I think you're muted still.
Jan, you're muted.
Sorry, totally forgot. When I saw all three, my brain went, all three of them were number one. And looking through that, but I actually ended up with the environment for number one. And the reason I did that is because it says, what is the highest priority for the role of community transit in 2050? Now, we're going to be working on those other things. We've already got plans where we're going to be and the kind of service we're going to provide, and looking for those people who aren't getting it now. But the environment and climate change has got to be fixed. And in my mind, it should be the underlying decision on whatever we do. That needs to be a focus, and it's going to be a focus to 2050. So it was difficult, because like I say, if I had a choice, if that was given to me, I would have put them all at number one. But that's where I'm at.
Chair, if I may. Yeah, I appreciate, and I'm kind of the same place with some of the other board members. It's like saying, which one of your 3 kids do you love the most? I mean, you know, it's kind of like Sophie's Choice here or something. But honestly, if we don't have ridership, we don't have an agency. And I agree with Jan. I think that this may look quite a bit different if we do this in 10 years or whatever. I'm just appreciating that we're asking these questions and we're trying to merge this together as one sort of way of looking at the business we provide. I mean, so that's where I'm at. I kind of scored them the same way, but I felt a little guilty about putting equity last, but it's really not last. They're all very important. And I guess this is just a way to score. So that's those are my thoughts. Thanks.
And
Go ahead, Tom.
oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, as an environmentalist orientation, I really wanted to put environment first, but as I thought through it, I actually ended up putting it third, with the idea in mind that if we pick up the areas first where the most people are riding, and then second, we reach out into the hinterlands a little bit more in the areas that are more underserved and bring them in, then we're getting more and more cars off the road. We're getting more and more, we're having a reduced need for pavement and roads, and the environment begins to be taken care of very nicely. Thank you. So I ranked them, I guess I'll summarize. I ranked them first, third, and second.
Anybody else?
I see Mr. Gallagher's hand up.
Oh, thanks. I missed it.
Thank you. To me, looking at this is from a somewhat scientific position, these are going to be extremely hard to evaluate until we get a picture of what the algorithms for the measurement process are. As an example, for me, the environment, while it's important, it's currently, I disagree with this, but currently the critical issue seems to be CO2. I believe there are a lot more than that, but let's assume for the moment that we use CO2. To me, the only way that we can measure that is CO2 emissions per passenger mile or per passenger foot or something of that order. So that when we begin to measure that, we're going to have to look at, as Tom pointed out, the pavement and everything else. that goes into that. And are we, in producing the bus, in running the bus partially empty, all of these kinds of things, the cost of the operator getting to the base, all the emissions for the maintenance, what are we going to use as a measurement tool? And I think this is, as an example on the second line, the environment, this is going to be a really cumbersome process. And it will be, I would recommend that we look at some of the ways to make measurements, such as for number 2 or number 1 or number 3. What is the tool? Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Anybody else? Okay, Aaron, back to you.
Oh, I see.
Oh, again, Christiana.
Thank you. I have something I'd like to make on behalf of Edmonds and the City Council.
Christiana, we're having a hard time hearing you.
I'm sorry.
There you go.
I turned up my volume.
There you go. Thank you. We got you.
I was really happy to hear about your long-range plan for public engagement and that you would be coming out to local jurisdictions and that you are going to analyze your data. I supported, or Edmonds supported, the initial SWIFT line, but felt that it should have been extended initially to the Edmonds Bus, Rail, and Ferry Transit Center. Since that time, we've had a lot of increases in multifamily housing units, which equates into increased ridership opportunities. But now the focus of SWIFT expansion is connecting to light rail. And I believe that SWIFT now doesn't have as strong a potential in Edmonds, but we have extension of the SWIFT line in our transportation element of our comprehensive plan. So I look forward to having those discussions. And Edmonds is sort of a unique transportation area because we're bounded on one side by the Salish Sea. But we have a highway of statewide significance that connects SR 104 and the Marine Highway System, which is basically the Edmonds-Kingston Ferry. We also have the Burlington Northern Station that provides peak passenger service on Sound Transit and other passenger service on Amtrak. And they're talking about double tracking that system. We also have a small bus transit area. So I'm really looking forward to diving deeper into the data and see what we can do with the Edmonds point of view.
Thank you, Christiana. Anybody else? Okay.
Yeah, and I really appreciate those thoughts, and kind of getting back to just a few comments that you all raised. I think someone mentioned, asking these questions at this stage is important. And what we're trying to do with this, these are questions that will be asked throughout the process. And when we kind of work through providing different information and analysis for how best to achieve each of these priorities, the long range plan will really tell that story to the broader community, to partner jurisdictions, et cetera, for how best you're going to fulfill each one of these 3 priorities, recognizing that they're certainly equally important, but each one of them requires a little different approach, a different strategy to best fulfill that. And so it's making a really clear statement to the public and to your partner agencies for what that looks like to achieve these particular priorities. So this process, this long range process, is really about continuing to ask these types of questions and then analyzing them, presenting results so we understand trade-offs and different options for fulfilling these priorities, and then advancing towards really solidifying what that story and that picture looks like to achieve these. So yeah, all of you kind of raising the, how do you rank these? How do you, rank your favorite child? This is certainly not meant to say one or the other. You can fulfill all three just through different means, which have kind of compounding benefits with that. So really appreciate kind of the additional perspective again of how we can think about asking this question and this type of question, and what is the information that can be useful moving forward. Before I just move into just recapping how we want to engage in the phase one public outreach, I'm wondering, does anyone, is there a fourth priority that really is separate from these three overarching areas of focus that you'd want to ensure that we're considering as we move through this process?
Well,
And if
for
not,
one-
go ahead. Yeah.
I do have one. I'm not sure it rises the level of this though, but I'm thinking of cost reduction, and cost reduction, I mean, that would translate to fare reduction. So I'm not sure how that would play out, but it might be something that we could talk about.
Yeah, and I think that's a great, thinking through fare structure and barriers to access. And that's, if I'm someone just trying to shoehorn it into one of these three E's, that would really, center around equity and trying to remove barriers to access and access to opportunities. So I think that's a great, additional consideration that we can fold into a lot of the scenario analysis, is how the cost recovery fare structure can really play out longer term. Well, let me touch on again what we're really hoping to ask and achieve with getting into the phase one public outreach, and I'll also pause for a question for this group just to get your thoughts. But again, this phase one is really about that initial visioning and understanding overarching priorities for the community as it translates into a 30-year outlook. And what we plan to ask is some version of not necessarily this specific question, but getting an understanding of where people stand for what they think the role of community transit is, not just today, but obviously going out to 2050, and providing some ranking or prioritization around that. We'll also be asking them to provide information on what are those emerging trends that community transit should really be focused on, both near term, but also with the long range plan. And again, what are some potential implications, and is there anything missing that the community would want to see addressed in a long range plan? So this really tees us up for informing the scenario analysis as part of phase two, what we should test, what are those key open questions that the community has that we can evaluate and provide some information, data, and outcomes to help in that discussion. So is there, as you think about, how you would go about, informing and providing feedback to advance the long range plan at this initial stage, is there anything that you'd like to hear from the public? Recognizing there are other outreach activities already that will be underway as part of network planning and some other initiatives that may focus a little more specifically on questions related to service, such as frequency and service span. So we're wanting to ensure that we don't duplicate those efforts and really identify a clear message for what we're asking with the long range plan. But I wanted to pause just in case there's anything specific that you think from a long range planning perspective you'd like to hear at this early phase one as part of the process.
Tim, I have,
council member. Yeah.
yeah, when you're doing the study, I guess what just crossed my mind is the information you get from the public will depend on what city and region you're in. Because what you're going to hear from Darrington is not going to be what you hear from Linden or Linwood. Sorry about that. But so I'm curious as to how you do that. I mean, are you going to organize it so yes, you have this information and it's from large cities with big populations, and it's an outlying area? So because there will be a definite difference in what we hear from the public depending on where they live.
No, that's a great question. And part of there will be a survey in this initial outreach with some supporting information just to provide context around what is the long range plan? Why are we asking this type of information? And part of the questions will focus on, again, where do they live, other demographic variables, so that then we're able to analyze and confirm, did we get a representative sample across the service area? Are there some potential areas that are underrepresented, just given some of the challenges with outreach during the pandemic, and recognizing some of those constraints? So we'll be analyzing the data through that lens to understand, are there geographic differences in how people have answered these questions, and how does that translate into overall service priorities, and priorities for thinking about how capital and service can really be balanced appropriately. So yeah, the geographic question is a key element of this, just to recognize some of the differences that we may hear across the region. Anything else? And I'll get into next steps then. So yeah, just teeing up kind of next steps. And as Rick and Roland mentioned, kind of kicking this off, we're in that early phase of really kicking off this process, really identifying all the information and elements that will go into the long range plan, and what are those key questions that we want to ask. So we'll be taking some of this initial information and starting to develop some of those draft goals. And part of that is getting feedback on the goals of the long range plan, and we'll be providing those to gather some review both internally and externally. I mentioned starting to engage internally with some other processes within your organization, giving updates as needed, and also collecting feedback internally, and starting the preparation for our phase 1 public outreach, which will begin in February of 2022, and recognizing a lot of the other outreach activities that will be underway already with other near-term planning processes. And then the fourth bullet, again, is really providing additional information and context on what are those trends and how do those trends really inform the planning process and the scenario development. So we'll be conducting that additional research and providing a summary that's really easily digestible for the public to review as part of the phase 1 outreach process. So again, initial stages with this project, and again, I really appreciate your initial thoughts as we think about what are those key questions we need to address, and how should we think about priorities moving forward for the long range plan. So with that, if there aren't any other questions, I think I'll turn it back over to Roland and or Rick just to kind of close this out.
Thank you, Aaron. I'll just say really appreciate the level of engagement today, and I'll turn it back to Rick.
Thanks. No, I echo that. This is the purpose today was to kick this process off and stimulate your thinking, and give you some room to think outside the normal crush of day-to-day business. So as you move into the weekend and you're thinking about things, and if any other thoughts, ideas come to mind for you, please don't hesitate to circle back with us. We'll be accessible, as you know, anytime a bright idea or inspiration strikes. So, I'm interested in, I think the comment you made, Mr. Chair, about the fare issue is a really interesting one. one of the themes I'm interested in bringing to this is sort of barriers and getting past barriers and bringing down barriers and changing our mindset from thinking about how to get people into the system to how to go get them. And so, it's an interesting puzzle, and it's always nice to be able to think long term. So anyway, thank you for the discussion today. That really concludes what we wanted to cover, and we'll look forward to engaging further with you as the process unfolds.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Goose. We appreciate your time and effort in putting in this presentation. It's going to be very interesting. Can't wait to get started and see how it goes. So that concludes our presentations. Next up is the chair's report. I really don't have anything to report, but I would like to have people take a step back, kind of think about what's going on around you. Look out for your neighbors. This last Sunday, we had a person on Facebook that came out to be having a crisis, and it was recognized by my wife, got her moved off onto a private message. I dialed 911 and kept that part of the thing going until we got them help from the sheriff's department, and it all came out all right, but it could have been bad. So you got to pay attention to what people are saying, try to figure out if they're okay, watch out for your neighbors, and let's get everybody to survive everything. So that's the only thing I have in a report. Board communications, let's start with Mayor Nicholas Smith.
Thank you. I've been doing transit since 1:30, so my head is a little mushy between sound transit and what you were doing today. So I'm sorry I didn't participate as fully as I should have today. Anyway, be safe, trick or treating.
Tom Merrill.
Thank you. I don't have anything to share today.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Joe Marine.
Thank you. I just am hurrying up and trying to get done this. This is the only thing between me and going to be able to meet my new granddaughter. My daughter came home from the hospital today, and there wasn't enough room apparently for me in the hospital. So as soon as I'm done here, I get to go meet her. So I'm excited. So just come on.
Okay, we'll get her to you can go if you like, Joe. Jan Schweddy.
I'm good. Thanks, Kim.
Yes, you are good. That's the fact. All right. Thank you. Sid Roberts.
Well, I just want to say thanks to Roland today. It helped me out. I got a call early this morning, an email, and was able to forward it on to Roland and staff. And he made a call to a customer, and customer now is thrilled. And it's just really awesome when we can respond that way. So thanks, Roland, and the other staff members that helped. I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Mike Gallagher.
All's quiet down here in Briar.
Oh, all's quiet. Okay, good. Mr. Norton. Lance, do you got anything you want to talk about? I guess not. Maybe next time. Did I miss anybody?
Hey, Kim.
Go ahead, Lance.
I just wanted to try to. I was muted. I'm sorry. My fault. No, I have nothing. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Did I miss anybody? I don't. We had. I'm missing a couple of the county council members. Looks like they dropped off for some reason. I think that's it.
Councilmember Johnson's still with us.
Oh, is she?
Yes, I am, but I don't have any comments other than happy Halloween and enjoy this fall blustery weather.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. Councilmember Johnson. We have no executive session. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hendricks. Is there any other business to bring before the board for our workshop? Rachel, did you have anything to tell us? No? I guess we're all square then, huh? We did good because Rachel has nothing. All right, then I will call for adjournment. Have a great week. We'll see you next time for the board.